Welcome to Ari랑TV's special coverage of COVID-19. I'm Min Sun-hee. Today marks Korea's 21st General Elections Day. Preventative measures have been put into place to ensure a safe voting and ballot counting environment. Now, we will have more on that later on in the program. But first, as always, we'll have the headlines for today with our Kwon So-ah and Noaram. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Now, so like I mentioned, it's our election day here in Korea, so we do not have our regular briefing on the coronavirus, but you are nonetheless going to give us the updates.
Yes, I'm glad that I can do the briefing on the latest numbers. And I'm also glad to say that we have less than 30 cases for the third consecutive day and also less than 50 cases for a whole week. The enforced social distancing measures guidelines appear to be effective because they are in effect for the fourth week now. So it's good to be seeing this slow down amid parliamentary elections. But let's take a closer look at the figures. Now we have a total of 10,591 cases with 27 new cases. That's the same rise as we had the day before. And we have, unfortunately, 3 additional deaths, bringing the death toll to 225. Now, more than 2,700 people are still in quarantine, while more than 7,600 have fully recovered. Now let's go over to our map. We have 11 new cases in the metropolitan region, 5 in Seoul and 6 in Gyeonggi-do province and 6 in Gyeongsang-buk-do province. And we have 1 case in Daegu, Busan, Gwangju and also on Jeju Island. So from past experience, we know that a single case does matter because one single case could become a so-called super spreader. So we have to still be careful about secondary and tertiary infections as well.
Of course. Now, while the numbers in Korea are slowing down, this pandemic is not a national problem. It's a global challenge. With that in mind, I understand President Moon Jae-in held virtual talks with his counterparts in this part of the world. What were some of the outcomes of that?
Right. That meeting, we've been talking about that with Aram yesterday as well, the ASEAN Plus 3 special summit. It was a video summit, of course. It was held on Tuesday afternoon, and it was during that meeting when President Moon Jae-in cautiously suggested that South Korea, although having been one of the countries hardest hit by COVID-19, has the situation gradually under control. Let's hear what he said.
적인 검증과 추적, 철저한 역학조사, 그리고 투명한 정보 공유에 기초한 국민들의 자발적인 참여가 큰 힘이 되었습니다.
Now, speaking to the leaders of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and his Chinese and Japanese counterparts, President Moon said South Korea's testing procedures, such as the drive-through and walk-through facilities and mobile applications used for self-isolators, were a result of IT as well as voluntary support from the nation's people. Meanwhile, the ASEAN members and 3 dialogue partners saw the need for strong solidarity for a collective response and discussed the establishment of the COVID-19 ASEAN Response Fund and reserves for essential medical supplies. President Moon also expressed his wish of maintaining essential flow of trade, investment, and people-to-people exchanges amid the economic fallout from the virus. And that's also in line with the president's vow to get ready for what he calls the so-called post-pandemic era, in which, according to President Moon, South Korea needs to turn the crisis into an opportunity because this economic crisis is expected to forecast to continue for a longer period.
Yes, unfortunately it is. Right, so let's take a look at the situation elsewhere around the world then.
All right, let's start with Japan, which is under a months-long state emergency since more than a week now, while its number of cases appears to be on a sudden, it seemed to be on a sudden decline, but now we're seeing a rise again with around 500 new cases reported this Wednesday. As of this morning, Japan has a total of more than 8,900 cases, and that is including the patients on the cruise ship, the Diamond Princess, and 16 new deaths have been reported as well. On Tuesday, Japan reported the biggest rise in deaths for a single day with 19 deaths. The Japanese government is expected to call companies for more production of masks and sanitizers and medical supplies such as ventilators this Wednesday. It looks like Prime Minister Shinzo Abe will make calls to such companies related to these productions. Now, speaking of medical equipment, Brazil has reportedly received its first shipment of made in South Korea diagnostic coronavirus test kits on Tuesday. Some 726,000 of those arrived in Sao Paulo, with 550,000 yet to be shipped at the end of this month. Brazil now has a total of more than 25,000 COVID-19 cases and over 1,500 deaths. And now for a closer look at other regions, the U.S. has now more than 594,000 cases in total and more than 25,000 deaths. And it is followed by European countries like Spain and Italy, Germany, which have all more than 150,000 cases. And France has also surpassed 100,000 cases. And also we're seeing a surge in the UK with 93,000 cases and more than 12,000 deaths. And those are the global updates that I have for you.
All right, so thank you for that. Aram, the general elections are on track here in Korea. I understand a list of precautions have to be taken into account.
That's right. These safety precautions are a top priority during these elections, and we've mentioned this multiple times previously as well. But just a reminder for those people, voters must wear masks. They must sanitize their hands by either washing them rigorously or using hand sanitizers. They must also wear these disposable plastic gloves when casting their ballots. They must also stay at least 1 meter apart from each other. But some experts are actually suggesting even further distancing, because when someone sneezes, we heard that droplets can travel 6 to 8 meters. So at least 1 meter, probably at least 2 is preferable. Keeping conversations to a minimum is also advised to avoid possible transmission. And if possible, voters are being persuaded to go alone rather than with a companion, so that the need for conversation and the possibility of infection is minimized. Also, there is this tradition, as we mentioned yesterday, of people stamping their hands as a sign that they did vote, and they put it up on social media and whatnot. But officials are advising people not to do that, even on their plastic gloves, because that is also a danger of infection as well. Those in self-isolation can also vote, but they must not show symptoms. They will be allowed to cast their ballots after the regular voting ends at 6 p.m. They can only stay outdoors between 5:20 to 7 p.m. and they must also not take public transport. Either they should walk or take a private vehicle. They must also notify authorities once they leave their homes and once they arrive at the polling station, so officials can keep track of their movements. And voting booths will be disinfected after each of them cast their ballots for the self-isolated people. But it'll be interesting to see what the voter turnout will be like today, because we saw a high number on the early voting period. But that was mainly to avoid the kind of crowd for today. So it would be interesting to see what the voter turnout is for today.
Did you guys actually know that on this election day we can get public masks? Everyone can get public masks today at the pharmacies, regardless of the 5-day rotation system, according to which you can only get masks once a week, depending on the last digit of your birth year.
Oh, so regardless of that, we can actually make purchases today.
Right. Well, today would actually be my day.
Oh, I see.
But yes, everyone can get them today.
You're a foreigner. You're still able to buy masks then?
I am able to buy the masks because I just have to show my ID card.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That's convenient.
Right, it is. Well, like Soa mentioned earlier, Adam, the economic outlook for the globe is quite bleak, and the IMF has some figures to make that even bleaker, should I say?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, any numbers or figures or data coming out regarding the economy hasn't been that positive recently, and the IMF, another gloomy estimate. It says the global economy is on track to contract sharply by 3% this year as a result of the pandemic. That's far worse than during the 2009 financial crisis, when it actually dropped 0.1%. So that's quite the difference. In fact, the IMF warned that the global economy will experience its worst recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The grim outlook came in the IMF's World Economic Outlook report on Tuesday. By contrast, in January, the IMF had actually forecast a global GDP expansion of 3.3% for this year. So it's almost a 180 from that forecast. For South Korea, meanwhile, the IMF predicts the country's economy would shrink 1.2% this year, which is in line with most projections from other global ratings agencies. In January, the IMF expected South Korea's economy to grow 2.2% this year, but along with the global economy, it's forecasting a contraction for this year for Korea as well. But it did note that Korea's comprehensive and swift containment and economic policies, which helped mitigate the negative impact on domestic activity, has kind of not made that number so grim. But as Korea is a country that relies heavily on exports, Korea will be hit because of the constraints on the trading partners that are currently in place. Now, for next year, the IMF revised its global growth estimate from 3.4% to 5.8%. I know that seems good, but that is expected to be coming from a lower base following the 2020's projected contraction. And the IMF chief also noted that there is still so much uncertainty surrounding the economic impact of the virus that it's hard to precisely estimate how and if there would be a rebound for next year.
Now, President Trump had threatened to cut funding to the global health body, and it seems that he's putting his threat into action now.
That is right. President Trump has announced he is halting funding to the WHO over its handling of the coronavirus pandemic. He has complained about their response previously. Here he was speaking at the White House on Tuesday.
Today, I'm instructing my administration to halt funding of the World Health Organization while a review is conducted to assess the World Health Organization's role in severely mismanaging and covering up the spread of the coronavirus. As the organization's leading sponsor, the United States has a duty to insist on full accountability.
Now, speaking of that review, Trump said the government review of the agency will take somewhere between 60 to 90 days. So it is not a complete cut of funding. It is a temporary halt to the funding while this so-called investigation is pending at the moment. So the US is the biggest overall donor to the WHO, contributing more than $400 million last year. The funding cut doesn't come as a surprise, though, as Trump has been increasingly critical of the organization as the global health crisis has continued. He has also reacted angrily to criticism of his own administration's response as well. And he's been trading bars with state governors as long as other health officials as well, particularly Dr. Anthony Fauci. His decision to halt WHO funding was met with immediate condemnation, as expected, with critics saying Trump has undermined international cooperation in the fight against the virus.
I see. Well, on a brighter front, Koreans stranded overseas are returning home, I understand.
Yes, so the latest is about 70 Koreans in Guatemala who are on their way back on a chartered flight via Mexico. They were seeking a way out after the Guatemalan government shut borders and grounded all flights. The group of 73 Koreans, to be exact, are expected to arrive at Incheon Airport tomorrow, so they will be here soon. There are also 8 Japanese and 3 Taiwanese nationals on board the flight. And so the embassies of both those countries have actually thanked the Korean embassy for its assistance in transporting their citizens. About 150 Koreans from Turkey, meanwhile, already arrived back home this morning. Among them was Korean women's volleyball star Kim Yeon-kyung. So she's back in the country. She obviously plays in the Turkish league there. They are all subject to strict quarantine measures, though, including the 2-week mandatory quarantine and self-isolation, as well as testing. Now, the flight from Turkey actually came after a deal where Hyundai Motor donated about 300,000 euros to Turkey and Ankara agreeing to purchase Korean medical supplies. So a win-win deal and a flight as well.
I see. All right. Aram, thank you for those keyword news. And so we'll see you again tomorrow with the headlines. Over in the UK, local and mayoral elections have been postponed to next year amid the COVID-19 pandemic as the country becomes the world's fifth to pass the grim threshold of 10,000 in the number of fatalities. Now, for more on the situation there, we connect live to a local politician in the UK. For the benefit of our viewers, Councillor, perhaps we could start with a short introduction of yourself.
Of course. Thank you very much for having me on the show. My name is Bora Kwon. I'm actually Korean British, and I work as a editor-in-chief for a news app, a smartphone news app in the UK. But I'm also an elected local government councillor in a borough called Hammersmith and Fulham, which is located in the west of London.
Thank you for that, Councillor. Now, the COVID-19 infections are escalating in the UK as they are in many other parts of the world, of course. Could you give us an overall picture of the situation there and perhaps the reasons behind the continued climb in cases?
Yes, so the UK is currently exercising a strategy of social distancing, and we call it lockdown, where essentially most of the country, the government has asked most of the country to stay at home, and business is suspended. The streets are very much empty. There are many people either working from home or essentially not working at the moment, and schools are also closed. So it's very much a new and troubling time for the country. It's not anything that we've ever experienced before, at least in modern times.
But Councillor, I understand that the lockdown is not as severe as those that have been imposed in other European countries. You are allowed to venture outdoors, I understand?
Yes, so there are government guidelines which state that you can, for example, visit the grocery store, so what they call essential shopping for things like medicines and food, and they also include that you can visit your local area for exercise, so a park or just to walk on the streets, but you're very much encouraged to stay near home, not to drive further out, to take a trip for the excuses of exercise. This is in contrast to countries like Spain and France in Europe, where there's actually further enforcement of walking and restriction, where local law enforcement or the army may even require paperwork or authorization. We're not quite at that stage in the UK.
I see. Councillor, what is the UK's view of Korea's countermeasures against COVID-19?
Oh, Korea is very much held up as it's called the gold standard. We are currently in the UK at very tragically over 12,000 deaths as of yesterday, whereas obviously in South Korea, I believe you haven't even reached 250 cases. We're also approaching 100,000 positive COVID-19 cases, confirmed cases from testing. And I think that we see that South Korea is a country with a population that's a bit more comparable to the UK than, for example, say like China or Singapore. And in the population density as well, it is very similar. So we're sort of looking at what Korea has done and what we can learn from it. But I think the infrastructure and the history, the public health history about the two countries are very, very different. So it's something that we're watching and trying to learn from very much.
As I mentioned earlier, Councillor, local and mayoral elections there, which were poised to take place in May, have been postponed to next year in light of the COVID-19 outbreak. Could you tell us more?
Yes, so as soon as the virus really started to take off in the UK and the death rate started to increase, it became more and more obvious that the elections would have to be delayed, and the government and local authorities, the Electoral Commission in the UK, did take the decision and recommendation that we cancel the elections for at least a year. And at the moment, that's the current situation. So to be honest, nobody's even talking about it. It's not high on the agenda. So obviously we will have to hold the elections at some point. And as I said, we've been told it's at least a year. Traditionally, elections where possible are held in May in the UK. So I think that's probably a realistic date that we're looking at.
Are there any measures that the government has adopted to address the possible problems associated with the postponement of these elections?
No, so at the moment, every elected official's term has essentially been extended for 1 year, and because of the gravity of the situation, most of the citizens are very much focused on the immediate day-to-day of how to prevent the spreading further and managing their own lives. So there isn't actually a lot of concern over the delayed elections because our Prime Minister Boris Johnson was actually hospitalised and tested positive for COVID-19 himself. I mean, he was in intensive care, and we had a 3 or 4 very, very worrying days where we really were concerned about his health. Thankfully, he's made a full recovery. But because of that, thought about the local elections isn't really high on anyone's agenda, either be it on a government level or on just a everyday citizen's level.
That, of course, is very understandable. Councillor, one final question. What are your thoughts about Korea's decision to hold its general elections today amid the global COVID-19 pandemic?
I think I can understand why they went ahead. I think obviously democracy is very, very important. And given the a very good way that I think Korea has managed the outbreak and the numbers of deaths and cases have gone down, I can understand why. I applaud the Korean citizens really for wanting to obviously exercise their democratic rights, even whilst there are clearly, global concerns about the pandemic. I can see the safety measures that the government and the local authorities have taken in place. I think from our point of view in the UK, it's just not something that we can even consider right now because, as I said, our immediate concerns are trying to halt as much as possible the spread of the virus. But in terms of trying to get life back to a sort of somewhat normal functioning rhythm, I think, Korea is very much to be applauded for putting the measures in place and carrying on with its everyday life.
All right, Councillor, thank you very much for those kind words and for being with us at this early hour in the UK.
Thank you very, very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
투표장에 도착한 자가격리 기자는 일반인과 접촉을 최소화하기 위해 별도 장소에서 대기하게 되며 일반 유권자의 투표가 끝난 후에 투표에 참여하게 됩니다.
The COVID-19 pandemic has had far-reaching effects beyond the spread of disease and efforts to contain it. It has disrupted economic activities, social engagements and political agendas, one of which is the holding of elections around the world. While general elections are on track in Korea, this is not the case elsewhere around the world. For more on that, we have Professor Song Se-ryun from Kyunghee University. Welcome, Professor Song.
Good to be here.
And we have Andres Sanchez-Brown, a correspondent for Spain's EFE news agency. Hello, Andres.
Hello, thanks for having us here today.
Thank you for coming. Professor Song, we'll start with you. I understand you went to the polling station early this morning. Do share with us your experience there.
Well, it was orderly, it was bustling, and I was in line for about 30 minutes, but it was longer before. I guess it reflects the high turnout for the advanced voting. Definitely, I felt the system was in place. Mask, everybody, and temperature check, and hand sanitizers, and they give out the plastic gloves. So it was very orderly, and it was very quiet. So it ended in about 30 minutes.
Oh, I see. Professor, do you believe Korea's decision to go ahead with the general elections is a reflection perhaps of its confidence in containment efforts, even amid the global pandemic?
Oh, definitely. I think that our numbers, infected numbers are under 50 for about a week. Last 3 days about under 30. And it clearly reflects that the condition is being managed at least. We're not the end of it. And also it shows that the confidence that we can get back to the normal But on the other hand, I think that the government wants to go ahead with it because coronavirus definitely created a condition where people are rallying around the government, and the ruling party is definitely helped by that kind of support. And they responded very admirably and being exemplary in the world. So in that sense, it's a very good situation for the government to go ahead and get the result. I think that everybody expects that it will be reflected in the election result.
I see. Andres, is the foreign media closely covering the elections here? Because it's one of the very few being carried out during this pandemic.
That's it. And yes, at least I believe the foreign media is covering this very closely. I myself actually visited a polling station this morning, and as Professor already pointed out, I saw all the measures being implemented there. The turnout seemed quite high, which is remarkable. But once again, I think the one of the reasons foreign media is interested in this is because the actual holding of the election proves that with the appropriate measures, the virus can be at least put under control, and we can go back to something like normal, I'd say. Yeah.
I see. Professor Song, concerns over COVID-19 brought about significant changes in campaigning methods. Am I right?
Right. A normal campaign scene would have been crowded, the media event, very crazy. I saw a little bit of that too. I didn't think that there would be a great crowd, but there were some events, especially in the Jongno area. But I understand that a lot of people are using the YouTube and online tools, and some people are just using unusual methods of doing it. Some people are going on marathon as being a campaign ways of doing it, and also donating blood and participating in some kind of a social or public service to get the name out. And I also saw people trying to get their names out because there are so many parties at this point, and probably we'll talk about that a little bit, and also candidates. So some people are trying to get their name out any way possible, even risking to be infamous rather than being famous.
Which is precisely why some observers were saying that the impact of campaigning may be very minimal to the public because of this limited face-to-face interaction. What is your view?
I have a mixed view about that. I think that people are more interested in the election this time because of the enhanced role of the government and how the public and the government working together could produce some good results. And we are also facing a very big challenge in terms of how the economy will pan out and also welfare systems going forward. Those are big concerns for the people. So big turnout, I expect that because of the advance voting rate was very high, the overall result probably would be higher. That reflects people's interests. So I myself found myself looking at the election leaflets, which I would not really normally do. So in that sense, a lot of people followed the same practice and kind of look at what they are promising and whether we are picking the right person.
And these promises they're making, the pledges, of course, by these parliamentary hopefuls, reflected COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes, many of them, because the immediate impact probably would be a lot of people will suffer from the reduced incomes. So we heard a lot of noises about how much money to get out to each households. So those were necessary and the welcome noises that we heard from them. But otherwise, usually they promise the world in each elections, especially National Assembly has been very dismal in their performance, but during the election times, their promises are always plentiful.
Andres, if you have any questions for Professor Song at this point, please be my guest.
Sure. Actually, I'd like to go back to turnout. You were talking about turnout, and I'd actually like to know if COVID-19, if the coronavirus has actually or would actually affect the turnout. And I don't know if we can get any clues from early voting or from absentee voting that has happened earlier?
Right. The advanced voting rate was close to about 27%, which was the highest in the general election era. So again, I think it reflects people's interest in the political process. And we saw firsthand that this time around, government and also especially CDC has performed very well, probably informed and educated by the MERS in 2006, SARS in 2002. So we had plenty of practices, arguably. But this time around, it was put together very well, and the government performed very well. So in that sense, people saw it, and it seems like, oh, government can do and provide some services. And probably the expectation is pretty high on the National Assembly this time around. Other than CDC and the government, I painfully point out that the National Assembly's performance has been very dismal and very dysfunctional even. But this time around, I think that people will expect a lot more. So if they don't perform, probably the criticism will be louder.
Professor, so what measures were taken by the government to ensure that those in self-quarantine could also exercise their right to vote?
Right, those people who want to exercise their civic right, they were provided with a special voting booth, and they were accompanied by those personnel who would make sure that they're being separated from or keep the social distance. So it was true of the advanced voting, but even this voting day, I think they are allowed to vote after 6 p.m., accompanied by people who would lead them.
Andres, will you be covering the voting by those in self-quarantine as well later on in the day?
Oh, yes, definitely I will. I understand that they are allowed to vote after 6, and they do have to be back home in self-isolation at 7 p.m. So, yes, we will follow very closely the vote counting and everything.
Andres, how do you assess Korea's decision to ensure democracy despite concerns over the COVID-19 outbreak here?
Well, mostly I do think the government's decision or the authorities' decision to actually hold the election was the right thing to do. Of course, in a democracy, being able to vote is the most important thing, of course. But also, as I think Professor Song has already pointed out, I think the government was very confident in the way it was handling the infections, the measures it was implementing. And of course, when you have less than 50 new daily infections for over a week, or you have 3 days in a row where the number of new daily infections is below 30, and with a lot of these infections being overseas cases, then of course the scenario is perfect for you to hold a general election.
How does this compare with the decision by other governments to postpone their elections?
Yes, unfortunately, Korea is an exceptional case. Korea has been handling the infection very well, as we've been seeing. This is not the case, as we just heard in the UK, for example, where local and mayoral elections have been pushed back to next year, or a case in Spain where there were 2 regional elections scheduled for April 5th. They have been postponed indefinitely because of the situation in Spain, which, as we've seen before, is still quite dire.
We'll go back to the situation in Spain in a little bit, but now the 2020 US presidential election is scheduled for November. And for more on that, we spoke with Professor Robert Shapiro from Columbia University earlier on.
Well, the campaigns have essentially been on hold because the candidates can't interact with people, and it's been difficult for in-person voting to occur nationally. Then, of course, the big question is what effect will the pandemic itself and the economic consequences of it, how will that affect the election? In terms of the campaign itself, I mean, Biden now is on track to get the nomination because Bernie Sanders has dropped out of the race and today endorsed Biden. So Biden will be the nominee unless the Democratic Party, by some weird happening, were to change its rules in some fashion that would disadvantage him. But he really hasn't been able to campaign. He was slow in getting his cameras and audiovisual equipment set up at home. Donald Trump has been hurt as well. He likes to campaign. He likes to hold rallies. That this is affected his style. It's kind of slowed him down. On the other hand, with the pandemic, every night he can do a briefing on the COVID-19 virus and where things stand. And each of these briefings is turned into, in a sense, a campaign event where he takes questions about how the government's doing and how the country's doing, but also he's been using that as an opportunity to criticize the Democrats and to criticize the media, the mainstream media that have been covering him. So they've constituted, if you will, a government-paid rally for a presidential candidate. The platforms of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party were the platforms of the individual candidates themselves. And in this particular case, healthcare has turned out to be a big issue. When Bernie Sanders said he was for Medicare for all, and he talked about all of the government efforts now to provide healthcare, he could kind of point to the government, the government in its actions moving toward a Medicare for all system, and even the Trump administration proposing to offer free testing and so forth. And so I think this crisis will really push healthcare reform, if not Medicare for all, as we call it here, some more expansive government program or set of programs to deal with expanding the availability and quality of healthcare.
Now, before we touch upon that in the U.S., the election in the U.S., first, Andres, like I said, let's talk about the situation in Spain. Cases there of infections now stand at more than 172,000. But I understand the government is coming up with new measures to curb the spread.
Well, yes, as you've pointed out, infections are above 172,000. Dead are over 18,000. Those are very big numbers. The situation is very, very different from what we're seeing in Korea. Right now, the measures the government really has in mind do have to do with the lockdown. The lockdown affects almost every economic activity that is non-essential. And the first thing that the government wants to do is, end up this lockdown situation. Some people say it could happen sometime around April 26th, but I think it might take a little longer because the increase rate of deaths and the daily infections is still around 2 to 3%. On the other hand, once the lockdown is over, I think the Spanish government is actually thinking on a series of measures that are very much in the line of what Korea has done so far. They want to test as many people as possible, they want to trace as many infections as possible, and they want to treat as many infected people in hospitals as possible too.
I see. Back in the U.S., Professor Song, primary elections have been suspended in 10 U.S. states. Can the nomination race still go ahead as planned, in your opinion?
Right. They have to go through the procedures. I think they'll just find a way. But in terms of primaries, if the main purpose is to see who's going to go up against the Donald Trump in November, we know who it is at this point. Bernie Sanders dropped out. He threw his support behind Biden, and Obama came out to support publicly. So in that sense, I think the result is all but over. So in that sense, in terms of the true purpose of doing the primaries, I think that there's not much of a difficulties, but they have to go through the process in the meantime.
Right. Former President Barack Obama spoke about picking a person who's looking at progress and not power. Meanwhile, with the U.S. now the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic, what impact has this reality had on the presidential nomination race? Well, this is what Professor Shapiro had to say.
Well, the COVID-19 virus and the outcome that we've seen thus far came after it was clear that Biden was going to be the nominee. So the effect on the outcome really hasn't been any. Biden getting the nomination was a foregone conclusion, but the big question would be whether Sanders would drop out and how soon Sanders would endorse him. Trump was already the nominee. But again, the big effect it has, it's prevented Trump from going out on the campaign trail and having his rallies to basically mobilize the support of his base for the election.
All right, one final question to both of our guests in the studio before we go today. Professor Song, what can be learned from Korea's holding of the general elections despite the global pandemic?
I think it would be an envious situation for many countries. But I think the real lesson is what happened before this election was held. Government was very transparent about the situation, and they responded very aggressively with the testing and pulling the national resources in their focus results. Again, it's probably because of the SARS and MERS experiences, but they were prepared at this time. So in that sense, government having a good control center and putting a system and a plan in place, I think that that's a pretty good examples that a lot of countries could follow.
I extend the same question to you, Andres. What can be learned?
I have to agree with Professor Song. I think the important thing that Korea has shown is what happened before. This is what lays ground for the election to actually take place. And this is a lesson that can be implemented after the peak of this pandemic passes in many countries. And if, of course, a country can hold a general election in the middle of a pandemic, then a lot of simpler things can be done. I think it teaches us all a lesson. And as I said before, I think it just, Korea's showing the world that we can, if you apply the right measures, life can almost go back to normal.
Right.
Almost.
All right, Andres, thank you for that. And Professor Song, as always, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Right, and on that note, we end the program for today. Do join us again tomorrow at the same hour for a look at the strong sense of social responsibility here in the country that has played an essential role in containing COVID-19. In the meantime, feel free to share your thoughts and inquiries with us through our social media accounts or our homepage, arirang.com. Thank you for watching.